This is a review of a book by T.M.S. Evans called Anthropology is Ethics, Nondualism and the Conduct of Sacrifice, Oxford Bergen Books. The review is Jim Harries. Jim Harries is a missionary in East Africa. He's been doing mission work in East Africa since 1988. The focus on Bible and theological teaching using the Luo and Swahili languages in Western Kenya, also further afield into Tanzania. I've entitled this review, The Ground is Deeper. In other words, deeper than we tend to think. Evans is an anthropologist. His field experience was in an Israeli kibbutz. He draws heavily on the ethnographies of Sudanese people. This brings a particular interest for me as he is considering his concerns in relation to African people and their ways of life and their ways of thinking. He builds on a prior publication, 1995, and also his book has a great deal of philosophy in it that can be more difficult for people not familiar with Western thinking. His book constitutes an attempt to equip contemporary anthropology through reorienting its foundations from the modern, basically, to the mythical. So it's a challenge to anthropology to rethink its ontological presuppositions. So it's challenging atheists' anthropology, I guess, in a broad sense. It's challenging secular, it's challenging dualistic, it's challenging materialistic and Marxist anthropology. So this book has 717 pages. It's a fair old volume. It's divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is 6 chapters long, looks at the social-political pathology of modernity. Part 2 looks at the ethical openness of archaic understanding. Essentially, in comparison with the ethical openness or lack of ethical openness, according to Evans, of Western and modern understanding. And part 3 is also 3 chapters long, and this traces the course from mythical to value rationality. So Evans perceives instrumental rationality, that is, the dualistic rationality, understanding and theory making that underlies modern thought, to be a subset of total understanding, which is mythic understanding. Now this diagram illustrates, this is my own diagram, what he's trying to say. Whereas Western academics and scholars tend to consider themselves to have a complete understanding and to be looking at others' more partial understanding, particularly those who are rooted in magical, mythical, animist, religious, and such like worldviews. Now, Evans actually reverses that and says, no, the reality is that the mythic understanding is broad, and the rational and reasoned understanding is a part of that. Because instrumental, this is the rational reason I'm talking about, arises from the mythical, it is in its basic sense also mythical. Now here's a threat to Western thinkers who like, of course this is a big struggle in philosophy, like to consider that their thinking is deeply rooted in something solid, basically positivism, which not that Evans deals with the issue of positivism, but he does spend some time pointing out that actually Western thinking is rooted in a kind of what seems to be a sea of mythical unspecificity. And out of that sea of non-specificity, somehow there's arisen what we call modernity, with all its strengths in terms of science and rationality and so forth, But as I say, what he's critiquing is the failure for modernity to perceive its mythical origins. Um, so moderns habitually avoid being open-minded in order to conceal their dependence on the mythical. Their dependence on the mythical, I guess they're ashamed of. And I think, to me, as a Christian believer, the reason they're concealing it is very clearly because revealing it would be revealing the need for a mystical engagement, let's say, by those people who would want to imitate what the West is doing. So it implies that in order for people to become modern and Western, they would need to engage Christianity. They prefer to consider dualism rather than mythical to be the means of access to reality and the perception of truth. Now, dualism is a central theme running throughout the book, and basically a body-mind dualism, a Descartesian dualism. Considering the ground of Western thinking to be other than dualism, objectivity and so on, threatens to undermine the integrity of Western thought. Now, I've already explained that in different ways. Western thought is closed, whereas mythical thought, according to Evans, is open. So that means that Western thought cannot tolerate its own foundations, or its own history, or its own grounding in the mythical, which is something that's kind of pretty obvious around the world today, but that Evans brings out particularly graphically. Anthropology itself, despite being rooted in modernity, must, following the above, have an ontology, be metaphysical, and build on the mystical. So anthropology here does not get away with the pretense that it's actually rooted in Western secular liberalism. Western secular liberalism, of course, itself is mystical insofar as its origins have to be considered or seem to be mystical, and anthropology's delving outside of secular liberalism into the mystical world, we need to take also as having mystical origins. For Evans, the mythical both incorporates and is basic to the rational, as I've already mentioned. The mythical that appears monist from a perspective of the rational is better understood as being non-dualist than as being monist. So one of Evans' favourite terms for mythical is a non-dualist, which of course is something that negates what is modern, and his point being that the contrast between modern rationality and the mythical gives the impression that the mythical is what we might call monism, where there are really no boundaries. But that's a misleading view of the mythical, arising from a perception that one is not mythical. Actually, monism is an overdoing of mythical. There are boundaries. They're just more fluid than are the boundaries that the modern and the rational would use themselves. The thinking of pre-modern people, like the Dinka of Sudan, does not divide reality into natural versus supernatural. Now, this is, of course, particularly of interest to me and a challenge I'm constantly facing in engaging East African people with the gospel of Christ, that there's this fundamental difference in our way of thinking. Now, in some respects, we could say that their failure to differentiate between natural and supernatural, their failure to be dualistic for Western actually, in a sense, means they don't think. But whichever way you look at that, this fundamental difference that I, as a missionary, am constantly battling with. So there's the diagram, total understanding, Western understanding. Evans considers the origins of reason to be irreducible to oneself, contrary to the position of Descartes. So Descartes, I think, therefore I am, is a kind of very self-centered basis on which then to build everything else. And that's the basis on which Western scholarship has been built. according to, I think Evans presupposes that. He says, no, actually, people are from the beginning responsibility and sacrifice. Sacrifice, in other words, having to sacrifice what you would prefer to do for the other. So human reason actually arises innately from people's relationship with others. One's responsibility to the other requires sacrifice, i.e. denial of oneself, and that starts very early. And that is so core to who people are that you cannot do as Descartes thinks you do and just say I am because I think. In other words, you could say, or the better alternative is I am because we are. The process of fashioning this sacrifice being inherently and unavoidably ethical, ethics are foundational to reason. So the ethical begins very early, if in terms of a child growing up, as in terms of the development of a community, the concern is always what is my responsibility to others? And by being where I am and denying someone else who would otherwise be in my position, what does that imply regarding my responsibility to other people? What sacrifices do I need to make for them? So this is like in the substratum to society. It's an ethical substratum and it's a mythical substratum. It's a pre-logical because we've not yet got any firm ground on which to do anything. Supposedly foundational a prioris are, according to Evans, actually synthetic. So a prioris that scholars tend to assume are created by people. A prioris are put together on the basis of an understanding of a ground that is neither objective nor theoretical, but is bodily and founded in human action. So where does Evans get his ground from? In short, in those two areas, from my reading of his book, the human body itself. I have a hand, and that is just implicit to who I am, and then everything else builds on that. And I have eyes, and everything else that is associated with the human body is part of the ground on which scholars can build. Add to that action, right? So instead of theory leading to action, Evans reverses that, and the action is a basis of understanding. And action is beyond theory. In other words, mythical people like those in Sudan, the Dinka and the Azande, don't explain their actions so much, but they explain the rest of life from their actions. To acquire truly universal human understanding grounded in practice and in the human body requires an upending of the Western notion that dualism, that produces theory, is a basis for truth. So the Western notion is that I'm standing here, action is going on over there, so I can hypothesize about the action on the basis of theory. But Evans wants to upend that and say this is only a part, a possible scenario out of many scenarios, let's say, that the mythical foundation can provide. This will require a denial of one's Western selfhood in favor of a relational identity in which one sacrifices for the other. So the Western individualistic selfhood, very difficult to define individualistic, and I think that's problematic in itself. But in our sense, that sees as foundational some kind of abstract theoretical thought, we need to put aside and say, no, what we are is what we owe to others. Descartes' thinking made the self as against the divine other to be a dualism. Now, people versus God. And of course, one thing that Evans emphasizes is when a dualism such as this one is created, then there's in lots of maybe innate mechanisms or one major mechanism that will always push one part of that dualism into being less and less relevant. So I think the dualism between humanity and the divine has had the impact of pushing the divine into relative irrelevance. This dualistic foundation, according to Evans, undermines anthropology up to contemporary times. So anthropology, rather than dualism being its strength, which would seem to be the case in a sense, because anthropologists come up with theories. They observe things and participate in things and write and process their theories. But yet, for Evans, this dualism is not a strength, but is something that undermines the anthropologist. I guess, in a sense, it makes them into someone peculiar, unlike the people they're studying, in such a foundational way that they cannot fully helpfully articulate those people they're studying. Dualism that claims some thought to be not mythical, at the same time invented blind faith. So without dualism, there's no blind faith, because you don't, in a sense, have to have faith. You just know what is. So God for Sudanese people is who is, whereas God for dualistic people is someone who you relate to or don't relate to, and you can believe in, and you can believe in blindly. So there's no blind faith outside of Western dualism, then, according to Evans. This makes the supernatural appear ridiculous, and I think this is what's happened in recent years, that careful scholars in the West, looking at their panorama of things as they appear before them, have found little room for the supernatural apart from some kind of remnant of a crazy irrationality. Actually, following reason also requires faith. So it's not a matter of faith or reason. Reason, we have to have faith in reason in order to follow it and so forth. So again, Evans is undermining the apparent contradictions, saying actually that there are no, we cannot take account of contradictions in terms of mythical life. So in that sense, the refusal to allow contradictions is a limiting of our perception, and a distancing of Western people from others. Modern reason that is built on dualism can neither be translated into or even dreamt by people like the Azandi, whose thinking is mythical. Big challenge here, of course. We all want Africa to develop, and there's so many theories and so much has been done to that end. Much of it has been based on secular liberal thinking for many years, like United Nations, World Bank, IMF policies have worked on the material, on the assumption that African people will be able to perceive the material world as do Western people, and when material becomes available, they'll incorporate that material into their lives in a rational way, and that will result in development. But Evans, on the other hand, suggests that you can't translate all that into the life of mythical people. They cannot even dream of it. So, citing Evans Pritchard, for example, if Evans Pritchard apparently suggested that if you were to translate the critique in, say, English of their addiction to witchcraft into the Azandi language, then that critique would disappear. Dualism, according to Evans, is the modern problem, or the problem of modernity. Now, I don't think he's alone in that, and in fact, what drew me to this book was the central focus on dualism. As a result of my own increasing comprehension that dualism is indeed a foundational difficulty that is tripping up Western scholars and prohibiting them from engaging helpfully with other people around the world. Evans advocates for anthropology as a means to learn from others. He's an anthropologist and he wants anthropology to go on. He then problematizes this advocacy. Anthropology for Evans needs to deny the myth of modernity, that reason requires no myth. So yes, we need anthropology, but anthropologists should be open to myth, and let's say they need to participate in myth, I guess Evans would say, rather than looking at myth out there, something they're dealing with. Learning from others requires using their language and being open to how they define themselves and how they understand the anthropologist. So this is something that's particularly an issue for me. I think to understand African people, we need to be engaging with them in their own languages, and without controlling them economically. This is what we call vulnerable mission. So there's overlap here with Evans' case and what I'm saying. Evans says we need to listen to the other. Now, of course, everyone listens to the other, but typically we listen to them in our own context, using our own languages as Westerners on the basis of our own presuppositions, which prevents us Westerners from listening to people as they're actually thinking and communicating according to their own understanding. It requires comprehension of ways in which people's identity is grounded in myth rather than in reason. Not rejection of ways, but comprehension of ways. So this to me speaks about the importance of, again, if we have this category of religion, I think it's a very problematic category. Religion, let's say, is important, but that raises other issues, which I won't address in detail here. Myth is important, and to just take people as if they're rational, I guess, is falling short. In monism, boundaries do not exist. In non-dualism, they are fluid or fuzzy. I already mentioned that. Non-dualists accept that things that are also not. And that's a challenge for a Westerner to come to Africa and find this constant kind of presupposition. Things can exist and not exist at the same time. Struggle that I'm constantly engaging because my upbringing in Britain was that things either are this or that, whereas in African contexts, increasingly familiar to me after all those years, is that need not be the case. Non-dualists accept that things that are also not. There is both commensurability and non-commensurability. They conceive reality ontologically. The whole of reality is ontological rather than, there's me looking at a material physical world, which doesn't mean that they cannot perceive the material physical world, because that's a part of that whole, as I illustrated in the prior diagram. But the mythical people, according to Evans, they perceive it and they don't perceive it, and they perceive it and don't perceive it in this kind of constant intermingling continuum, my terms of how I read Evans. Evans, drawing on Wittgenstein and others, considers that to undermine magic on the basis that it does not follow Western reason, as was practiced by James Frazer, is little short of folly. So struck me this citing Wittgenstein's undermining of James Frazer's The Golden Bough, famous condemnation of magic as folly. No, magic does what it does. It's not that mythical people are failing, it's just that their perception, or it's rather their perception is different. Thinking that is not based on theory cannot err, but needs expansion. So, example here, someone wanting to command an illness to leave, if the illness doesn't leave, then they're obviously not commanding it in the right way. Now, we have the practice of exorcism being critiqued. Westerners exercising an evil spirit, who they don't believe is there in the first place, seems rather futile exercise. But to those people, like many of my African colleagues here in Western Kenya, for whom this is innately the right thing to do when it comes to suffering and illness and misfortune and so forth, then the question is not whether exorcism is sensible or not. Of course, it is. It works, inverted commas. So how do you do it? Which are the words which will be most effective in removing the disease? That's the question from within. Questions of magic are the questions from without. From the ground, ideas are imprisoned in action. That is to say, actions by bodies, not theories, are foundational to ideas and reasons. So back to this notion of, what does provide the ground for our thinking? And it's not ideas, but actions first. Ideas are imprisoned by actions. The actions continue, the ideas emerge from them if they can manage to escape from that prison. But of course, they're continually being brought back into those action prisons. Hence, ritual reconciles. Ritual that scientific worldview struggles to see, but yet does see, works. The efficacy of ritual is what proves the veracity of non-dualism, says Evans. So then the body, like your hands, even your eyes, the eyes palpate what they see, Evans suggests, being the grounds for understanding, and magic being the bedrock, the theory, meaningful existence is of synthetic origins. So those are the things that happen on the back of which we build meaningful existence. Not much of what is considered a priori is rooted in those foundations for understanding. Any science that denies this is wearing blinkers, says Evans. So, my own thoughts here. The great value of this book is in its carefully argued comprehension, well rooted in the literature, anthropological and philosophical case for a reconsideration of the grounds on which much contemporary research is built, especially the anthropological. I consider this to be a vital contribution, given ways in which today's globalization that is bringing people together as never before requires a more careful listening to the other than is possible without compromising many assumed foundations of modernity. Though we need to put aside assumed foundations of modernity in order to helpfully communicate with um, others outside of the West. I think African tribes particularly, but I think this is much wider than just that. So here's another diagram, the African world as against Western thinking. Now, my point here is that the thinking arising from Africa is different from that in the West, and the means to connect has to be below the surface, which I'm here considering the mythical substratum. Now, I'm increasingly convinced by that, yet the dominant formal practices that endeavor to link and communicate between Africa and the West are oblivious to that. In other words, they're often, in many ways, Marxist, materialist, and there's this assumption that Western language, English particularly, is going to be an effective medium in helping people from Africa understanding those from Europe and the West. So just to add, those who find this review challenging, the first half of the free sample coming from Amazon and as a Kindle sample, I suggest may satisfy you for this book. Obviously, it's available freely. Over and beyond that, it's a hard read. At least for given the limitations of my knowledge of philosophy. If I'd have been more deeply rooted in philosophy and anthropology, then it might have been an easier read. But there you go. It's challenging. Now, I think, to me, I'm hoping that this deep dive into Evans' thinking will help me to overcome some of the barriers that I've long struggled with in order to better comprehend my African colleagues and therefore to be better able to work with them and minister to them and be appreciative of them. Thank you.